Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk a little bit more about those 4 phases of book creation. We're on to phase 2, which is drafting. Phase 1 was planning. Drafting is where you're going to write the dialogue, write the prose, and make your book exist. At the end of this phase, you will have a book, and then you are well on your way to actually finishing that off and delivering it to consumers. And it's a great feeling to finish phase 2. It's personally my favorite phase to be in. I get the most creative satisfaction out of the drafting phase because I enjoy creating prose on the fly. I enjoy figuring out the dialogue. That to me is the greatest amount of gratification, and it's the biggest satisfaction when you finish this phase because you have a book. You can look at it, you can read it, you can enjoy the story. It's a great place to be. However, phase 2 is also the phase where most people tend to stall out with their creative process, where people tend to abandon their books, where people get to a point where they have writer's block or some other impediment that's stopping them from finishing the phase. And the main reason that I think people don't finish their draft is that they haven't adequately planned it in advance. So if you go back to that planning phase and you're doing all the little plot details, you have a solid sequence of events that the book is going to go through, you shouldn't really get to a point in your drafting phase where you don't know what's going to happen next. And that's usually what writer's block is. So writer's block tends to afflict mostly people who haven't done any planning for their book. They have a vague idea of what they're writing, they start writing, they get to a point where they don't know what happens next, and it's writer's block. And there's a couple ways that you can work around that. I made a video a long time ago, like some ways to kind of bust through it. But really, if you get to that point, you should go backward to your planning phase, see what you've done up to there, and figure out where you need to go to end the story and kind of backfill and do a little bit more planning, and that's really going to help you get to the end of it. However, sometimes you can do a lot of planning, and I have personally encountered this, and you stall out in the middle of your drafting phase because as you're writing the story, you become less convinced with what you've planned, and then you have to go back and change the plan and rewrite what you've done or abandon what you've done in some cases. So I've been there as well, and that phase 2, the drafting phase, can really, really trip you up. But if you've done a good job planning, it's just executing the plan, and it can be very fluid and very easy. Here's a couple of tips, though, for people who are maybe having some difficulty in the drafting phase or want to just try something different, because everybody has some different workflow ideas. One of the things that you can do is, rather than writing beginning to end, this is the way that I tend to write a book. I start on page 1, I end on whatever the last page is, page 500 or something, and then that's the draft, right? Some people operate totally differently, and you got to figure out what process is going to work best for you and what appeals most to your personality, because we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and we're all gratified by different little micro actions as we're doing this kind of work. So one thing you can do, this is something that screenwriters do a lot, including myself, is you write the scenes out of order. You have an idea for a scene and it's important for the plot and you know what wants to happen to it. You can jump right to that scene and write it. The only hang up there is making sure that you know where it's going to go and you have them ordered. And there's different writing software is better for that. I write everything in Microsoft Word. I'm pretty old school and really straightforward, and Microsoft Word has all the organizational tools that I actually need. But Scrivener, I think, has some options for this. Or you could write in Final Draft, which is actually a screenwriting program. But you write the scene, and then you just jump to whatever scene is on your mind. It is most clear in your mind and most important, and you essentially write the story out of order. And if you plan the story well, it's really not a bad thing to write it out of order. You're like, your mind's really focused maybe on this scene that happens later in the book. You can write that scene. Just go ahead and write it. And then you have a clear idea of where you're arriving, and that maybe inspires you to write an earlier scene. And then you kind of jump around filling in until eventually you have it there. So you don't have to write a draft in order. You can write it completely out of order. And in some cases, the workflow is a lot faster and better, especially if you're not, if you don't quite have the strengths. Like one of my strengths is I'm really able to write prose on the fly. I'm really able to just go straight through a scene and know exactly what's going to happen in it, improvise and do some what I call immediate revisions, which is like I get into a scene, I'm like, I'm going to change that piece, and then it just kind of works. I tend to be pretty good at that, but other people aren't. They need a little more planning, or they have a harder time imagining a scene that isn't as important as something else. So you can try writing things out of order, and if you use a plot organization tool, like if you're working on a hero's journey format, or you're using Plot which is something I suggested way back in November. I'm like, I'm going to use this to plot out my big scenes, and then that's going to help me figure out all my sequences, and then I'll just write it from there. And it only took me like a couple of hours to plan 3 books that way, and then I wrote them in about 5 weeks and had them put out in about 8 weeks. So you can do this pretty fast if your planning's done pretty right. So you can write things out of order. Another thing that you can do is just write the dialogue. Most story is carried by dialogue, and that's because characters are speaking dialogue, and that's what people empathize with, and that's what they attach to in a story. So if you just write the dialogue like a screenwriter and don't worry about any of the prose, or just put like a note of what the prose needs to be and just focus on dialogue. And the prose, you'll figure out if you write a lot of dialogue, you don't need as much prose sometimes as you think you need to fill out the action. The prose is making obvious to the reader something very clear that's happening. But you don't need to go on for pages and pages describing how characters feel or look or this kind of stuff. Once you write the dialogue, things start to become kind of obvious, and you can go back and write the prose later. And that's really helpful if you feel particularly weak at prose, which lots of people do. And by prose, I mean the paragraph stuff of describing action in places and that kind of thing. So if you feel weak with that, start with what you're strong with, dialogue. Then fill in the parts that you feel weaker with, so you can focus on one area of strength at a time, or you can do that in reverse. Write the prose, then write the dialogue. I think it's better to write the dialogue than the prose, because I feel dialogue is a little bit more important than prose, but start with your strength and then go to your weakness. And if you can try some of these different things out, you may find that you're able to get through your drafting phase a little bit easier. So if you get a little hung up, you feel like you just aren't in a place where you can write a good intro paragraph to a scene of prose, just skip it and go straight to the dialogue that you know is in your head. And you'll find that first paragraph is a little bit easier to write as well. So there's some tips for you. Hopefully that's helpful. Once you get to that final page there, and you write the end, then you get to move on to phase 3, which is the revision phase. Some people, I will tell you, do revisions while they're drafting. It just depends on how you do. I sometimes will do small revisions while they're on my mind. This is my last thing to sort of prepare you for phase 3. It's because I write from beginning to end, I may get somewhere through a book and I'm like, I really want to tidy up this part of the book that I know is not consistent with the later part of the book. So I actually make a checklist in a separate document of things I got to fix right away when I finish my draft. Like, I need to go back to chapter 2 and do this. I need to go to chapter 1 and do this. I need to go to chapter 4 and do this. And some people don't know what's happening in chapter 4 or chapter 1. I do. I remember pretty much everything I've done because I've planned it out pretty well. So I know where the events are, and I'm like, oh, I need to go back and make this character, I need to make him look differently, or I need to have more of him at the beginning to set him up at the end. And I make a checklist of things to add or subtract. So when I get to the end of the draft, I can go back and immediately do those. And that also doesn't distract me. I always had this forward momentum going towards the end of the book, and I don't have to stop and go back and fix and then lose track of where I was at or kind of lose my flow of what I'm doing. If my mind's really focused on that next scene, I step away from the computer, I think about the next scene, next day I come back, I can just write it, and I'm good with that. So that's something that you can think about doing, is making the checklist. Some people will just go ahead and do the revisions while they're writing it, or each scene they write, they go back and read it out loud and fix things and change consistency. So it depends what really appeals to you. I met an author, Steve Yarborough is his name, and that's what he did, is every time he wrote a scene, he would print it out physically on a piece of paper and read it out loud and then fix sentences. And he's like, I would hate for someone to ever think that I wrote a bad sentence, he said to me once. And it was like, oh, wow. I mean, he really, really cared about the micro to the point that he would revise immediately after writing because he was so wanting those details to be correct. So you have to figure out what appeals to you. I think it's best to try to hold your revisions off till you finish it, because you may not understand until you finish the entire plot what you really need to do. Once you see the entire work, you can see where the details aren't quite adding up, and you can go back and fill them in. It's kind of like if you're doing a big mural painting. If you're doing a giant mural and Napoleon's in it, right? And if you're just focusing on the shape of Napoleon's nostril, you may want to finish the painting before you go back and see whether that detail is correct or if it's at just the right perspective. If you fix the nostril and then you write and then you're like, oh, you know what? His face is slightly at the wrong perspective. I got to repaint the whole face. And I spent 2 days just making the nostril correct. You don't want to end up with a situation like that where you're deleting stuff that you spend a lot of time on. So I tend to say, focus on finishing the draft, then do your revisions. That's the way I like best to work, but you can do what works for you. Feel free to break that rule if it improves your product or improves your workflow or satisfies you more. So have a good one, and I will see you guys next time, as always.